In order to understand how gas exchange occurs, especially between the alveolar air and the pulmonary blood, we have to understand just the basic laws that govern the movement of gases and the behavior of gases. The two gas laws that we'll take a look at are Dalton's laws and Henry's laws. So let's start with Dalton's laws first. Dalton's law allows us to understand how gases move down their concentration gradient in relation to pressure. So specifically when we're talking about gases, we're talking about their pressure and not technically concentration. But because we've used the term concentration gradient so much, I feel like you're probably more familiar with that substances move from high concentration to low concentration. Similarly, gases move from an area of high pressure to low pressure. With Dalton's laws, we're specifically focusing on that pressure difference, and we're looking at the pressure of gases specifically. The partial pressure of a gas is the pressure that the gas exerts in a mixture of gases, and each gas in a mixture will exert its own pressure regardless whether or not there are other gases that are present. So to understand again the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, it's useful to know these laws. And according to Dalton's law, again, I'm just repeating, each gas in a mixture exerts its own pressure as if the other gases are not present. What does this mean? So here I have oxygen and I have nitrogen, and I have oxygen and nitrogen. If oxygen were present on its own, the total pressure that it has in this case is 159. If nitrogen was here on its own, its total pressure would be 593. But let's say both of these gases are in that same container. What does the total pressure look like? So all I have to do here is just add those values. So the pressure of oxygen is 159. The pressure of nitrogen is 593. Just adding those together will give me the total pressure because that's how these gases behave. Their partial pressure, their pressure as if they're on their own, is going to be the same when they're mixed with other gases, and we can calculate that total pressure by just adding the individual pressures. That's the first one. The second law is Henry's law. Henry's law is more focused on the solubility of gas. How soluble is it in a liquid, and what determines if it's going to stay soluble in that liquid and not just kind of bubble out. And here the law states that the higher the partial pressure, so if it has a high partial pressure over a liquid, and in that case it will have higher solubility, and the more likely that the gas is going to stay soluble, dissolved in that solution. So think, for example, of a carbonated drink. Carbonated drinks have a very high pressure. So they're usually, the cap is tight, enclosing that whole can, let's say. If the pressure in there is released, so you open that can or open that bottle, the pressure of that gas will decrease, and the gas will bubble out and escape because the pressure goes down. But as long as it's in that can, as long as the cap is still on, there's high pressure in that bottle or can, and that's going to drive the gas to stay dissolved in the liquid. And this is the idea here, that the higher the pressure, the higher the partial pressure, the more likely that the gas will remain in the solution, dissolved in the solution. If the pressure is not high enough, if it's low, then it's going to bubble out. And it also depends here, of course, how soluble the gas is. For example, the solubility of carbon dioxide is 24 times greater than the solubility of oxygen. So it's more soluble at the same pressure. So there's that to consider as well. But the higher the pressure, the more likely it's going to remain soluble in that liquid. So why are we talking about this? That's because it's related to respiration. And we have two types of respiration, external and internal. Both involve oxygen and carbon dioxide and how they move from areas of high pressure to low pressure. External respiration refers to the movement of these gases in between the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries, so the blood vessels and the alveoli at the level of the lungs. And in internal respiration, we're talking about the movement of these gases between the cells, so the tissues of the body, and the capillaries. So this is when we deliver the blood to the tissue and the exchange occurs at the level of the cells. Take a look at the first one, external respiration. What is external respiration? Remember, this one is at the level of the lungs, so the exchange is between the alveoli and the blood capillaries. The exchange is between CO2 and O2 and these different areas. So we know under normal conditions, oxygen is going to diffuse into the blood, and carbon dioxide will leave the blood and go into the alveoli so we can get rid of it. Now we know that just logically that this is how this is going to happen. But why specifically does it happen that way? This is because of the differences in the pressure and the solubility of those gases. For example, the pressure of oxygen, 40 in the capillaries and in the alveolus, 105 to be exact. So just by looking at this, we can conclude that the oxygen pressure in the alveoli is much higher than the oxygen pressure in the capillaries. So for oxygen, it's going to diffuse from the alveoli into the bloodstream because it will go down its pressure gradient from high pressure to low pressure. For CO2, on the other hand, it's the opposite. The CO2 pressure in the blood is higher than the CO2 pressure in the alveoli because the blood that is carrying the CO2 back from the tissue, the pressure here is around 45 and the pressure here is about 40. So for CO2, the movement is in the opposite direction. The CO2 gas will move from the blood into the alveoli. And this is again external respiration, exchange of gases at the level of the lungs between the alveoli and the blood capillary. The opposite will occur in internal respiration. Internal respiration occurs at the level of the tissues. It's between the tissues and the blood capillaries. This is where the exchange is going to happen. And the pressure will look a bit different here. For oxygen, the pressure in the blood is pretty high because blood is coming from the heart with lots of oxygen through the systemic circulation. It's around 100. And because these cells are constantly using oxygen for cellular respiration, their concentration or pressure for oxygen is pretty low. It's around 40. So we constantly need to replenish those cells, and oxygen will diffuse this way from the blood capillaries into the cells. The opposite will occur for carbon dioxide. The pressure in the cells is higher because these cells are constantly producing carbon dioxide from cellular respiration. The concentration of carbon dioxide here is around 45, and the concentration of carbon dioxide in the bloodstream is around 40. So carbon dioxide will diffuse from an area of high pressure to low pressure, and the blood will transport it then to the lungs for, again, external exchange. How fast this exchange happens depends on several factors. The first one is the partial pressure difference. So how big is that gap between the pressures on either side? So we saw, for example, that pressure for oxygen in the alveoli is around 105, and in the blood is around 40. So there's a big gap there of 65 at least. And the bigger the gap, the faster the rate of diffusion. Oxygen will diffuse pretty fast because of this huge difference in pressure. And that's what that means. If you have a higher pressure difference, then the rate is going to increase as well. Large surface area for gas exchange is another factor. So if the alveoli have this huge surface area where the exchange can occur, the more oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange will occur, the faster it will happen. But let's say something obstructs this process for any reason. Certain conditions can decrease the surface area, and that could lead to lower rate of diffusion and lower amounts of oxygen in the blood. The other factor here is the small distance, diffusion distance, across the respiratory membrane. So if the distance, like we discussed, it's very thin layer, and you have maybe a couple cells that are in between, but the diffusion can occur because of this thin structure. And as long as that structure remains thin, then the rate of diffusion will stay high. However, if there's a condition that causes, let's say, a buildup of fluid between these structures, then now you have a larger distance for these gases that they need to cross, and that will slow the rate down. But as long as that distance is small, the rate will remain high. We also have molecular weight and solubility of gases. These factors can impact the rate of exchange. We already know a little bit about molecular weight because you know that the smaller the molecule is, the faster it will diffuse. So we're going to see an increase in the rate of exchange. And we expect oxygen to be smaller than CO2. It has a lower molecular weight, and therefore we would expect it to at least diffuse across the respiratory membrane quicker. However, the solubility of carbon dioxide is higher than oxygen. It's around 24 times higher, and we just discussed solubility. If it's 24 times more soluble, then that rate of exchange will go up pretty significantly. So taking into consideration the molecular weight and solubility, carbon dioxide will diffuse around 20 times faster compared to oxygen. So those two can go hand in hand when it comes to rate of exchange, and for carbon dioxide, it will diffuse much more quickly. So if there's any condition here that will impact the rate of diffusion, then oxygen insufficiency will be reached much more quickly than buildup of CO2. So now that we know about internal and external respiration, and we know about the different factors that influence how fast these molecules diffuse, let's talk about how they're transported in the blood. We know that for at least hemoglobin, it's part of the red blood cell. It's a protein that combines oxygen, especially in its heme portion, specifically the iron ion area. So iron is what binds to oxygen in that site, in the heme portion. And since the hemoglobin has 4 of these heme areas and 4 of these atoms of iron, then it will be able to bind to 4 oxygens. When the hemoglobin is completely saturated or bound to these oxygen molecules, it is usually saturated is what we use the term, and we call it oxyhemoglobin. and that's also considered loading. So when oxygen binds to hemoglobin, we say that it's loading onto hemoglobin. When it's unloading, that means the oxygen has dissociated from hemoglobin and it's dropped off in the tissues, and now the hemoglobin is called deoxyhemoglobin. So proceeding to the right of the reaction here, we call that loading, and proceeding this way, we call that unloading. And for oxygen, around 98% of the oxygen is bound this way. This is how it's carried in the blood. It's stuck to hemoglobin. Only a very small portion of it is dissolved in the plasma. For carbon dioxide, 23% is actually carried by hemoglobin, and hemoglobin can bind to carbon dioxide as well. 7% of it can be dissolved in the plasma, but the majority of carbon dioxide is transported as bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is an ion that forms when there's carbon dioxide in the blood. It also functions as a buffer. This is how you might have seen it before. But when carbon dioxide is in the bloodstream, it will bind to water through the action of an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, and it will catalyze the reaction and give us carbonic acid. Carbonic acid will dissociate into H+ and bicarbonate in the blood, and this is how it's transported. Carbon dioxide is transported in the form of bicarbonate. 70% of it is transported in this way. Even though carbon dioxide is transported as bicarbonate, when it reaches the lungs, it needs to be converted back to carbon dioxide so it can diffuse out of the capillaries into the alveolus, and then eventually we exhale it out. So in order to do that, bicarbonate will diffuse into the red blood cell and will combine with H+ and go back to carbonic acid. And from carbonic acid, it will dissociate into carbon dioxide and water, and then carbon dioxide will leave the red blood cell and then diffuse out of the capillary into the alveolus. Whenever we're taking negative ions into the red blood cell, we need to maintain the electrical balance here. So what the red blood cell does is it kicks a bunch of chloride out as it takes up the bicarbonate, which is also negatively charged. So if it's taking negatively charged ions inside, like the bicarbonate, it has to get rid of the chloride. And when it does that, we call this a chloride shift. We exchange the negative ions to keep that internal electrical balance for the red blood cell. The opposite happens in here, internal respiration. So when the carbon dioxide leaves the tissues and enters the blood, it will combine with water and give us eventually bicarbonate. Bicarbonate will leave the red blood cell into the plasma, and that's how it's going to travel. And when we're kicking out the bicarbonate here, we need to take in chloride to keep that negative ion balance. And when we get back to the lungs, the opposite will happen again. This is where we take back the bicarbonate, combine it with H+, get CO2, get rid of the CO2, and get rid of chloride to maintain that negative ion balance. So when it comes to transport of these gases, most of the oxygen will be bound to hemoglobin. Some of the carbon dioxide can be bound to hemoglobin, but the majority is transported as bicarbonate.